Well, let's get started then. This is this first session is going to be basically an expansion of the presentation I gave to the Camera Club about a year and a quarter ago now. It was August of last year. The first session, I guess, in the preseason of last year's Camera Club program. That was a 45-minute introduction to infrared, and I certainly didn't go very deep into the subject. This is a 2-hour introduction to infrared. If it takes that long, I haven't actually timed it out, but it does provide considerably more information. I also want to do it pretty informally because I don't want to leave anybody behind. So if you have questions, if you're not sure about something, please don't hesitate to interrupt me and ask. They're the only dumb questions, the old cliche goes, is the one you don't answer. So, or you don't ask. Yeah, sorry. So please feel free to interrupt any old time. And let's see, anything else I need to say? I guess not. If I think of it, I'll come back to it. Why is my slide not even advancing? Come on. There we go. Okay. So this is a list of the 4 sessions we're having in this workshop. First one is today, of course, and I've already kind of told you what's in today's. Also, there was a lot of description in the workshop description that you've already seen, so I'm not going to repeat what was in there. Next session is November 4th, and it's going to go into a lot more depth on the how-to side of things, how to set your camera, operate it, evaluate the images, etc., and how to process them. Lots of information about post-processing in that one. And in fact, I'll even give you a demo or two about doing it. And at least one of the images I do the demo with is going to be one I haven't previously processed, which means I don't know quite where it's going to take us. But that'll be an interesting exercise and illustration for everybody too. This is Larry Gallagher, by the way. Everybody, and it's okay. We understand you had a good excuse. John covered for you.
Thank you, John.
The third session, November 29th, is then intended to be a field trip where we actually go out and do some shooting. And I haven't planned that field trip yet. The timing of it isn't ideal because by then all the deciduous trees will have lost their foliage. But that's not necessarily a problem. I know places where you can get good foliage even at in that season. For one thing, ponderosas glow very nicely in infrared.
Yes.
And so we could go north rather than south and get some pretty good foliage that way. The pinions and junipers around here don't glow quite as much, although I know how to make them glow in post-processing. Depends also on what filter you're using. The other possibilities, we could go farther south and we'd find more foliage in Phoenix, for example. Palm trees glow nicely in infrared. So that's another possibility. We can talk about that probably at the November 4th session, decide what our preferences are and plan it out at that time. So I won't elaborate any more on that now. But November 29th is the field trip. And then December 16th, which happens to be Beethoven's birthday, if you're a follower of Schroeder and Peanuts, I want to get together again to share images, including those that we captured during the field trip, and talk about how we got them and how we processed them, and maybe trade notes about what worked and what didn't, and that sort of thing. I think that would be really rewarding. So I want to schedule that. We already have for the other 2 sessions that we're meeting in person, we have the bigger room, the fellowship hall here reserved for those 2 sessions. So we'll have plenty of room and a bigger screen, a better screen than this one to use to share images. So that's what our plan is for these 4 sessions. Any questions? I'll move on if not. Here are the topics we're going to cover in this session. And by the way, you don't need to take copious notes because I'll share all my slides with you once we're done. So don't worry too much about that. But I'll talk about why you shoot infrared or why you might want to, what you can shoot with it, and then get into a little more technical stuff about what is infrared light and where does it fit in the broader electromagnetic spectrum. And that leads directly into a discussion of the choices you make when you convert a camera for infrared, when you choose a camera or convert a camera for infrared. And then we got to talk about lenses too, because there are some tricky things about lenses. Most lenses, in my experience, work pretty well, but there are exceptions to that and hazards you need to watch out for a little bit. I'll give an overview of capturing infrared images. I'm not going to go into too much depth this time, but just give you an idea of what's involved in that and maybe some things you should look for. I want to talk, and I'll also talk about what kinds of images, what kinds of subjects and scenes work well for infrared in my experience. I'll talk a bit about processing infrared images, and again, not in any great depth because that's reserved for our next session, but give you a quick overview of that. And then finally, links and references. There are 3 companies I can recommend for getting an infrared camera. You can either get an existing camera that you have converted, or they actually sell cameras that are already converted, so that's another option. And there's also a wealth of knowledge out there on the internet, including from those 3 companies. All 3 companies have lots of tutorials and articles on their website about infrared photography and what works and what doesn't, what your choices are, etc. So, and then a few other links as well. So that's what we're going to cover today. Moving on. Why do we shoot infrared? Well, first and foremost, it's different. And it really is different. It opens up a new universe of creative and expressive possibility. I don't normally read my slides verbatim, but that statement bears repeating. It's a huge, basically limitless universe. And I'll give you an example of the sorts of things that are possible with a single infrared image, a single raw file. The amazing variety of different looks you can get out of that, out of a single raw file. And that's true for black and white as well as color. I'll demonstrate that in our next session when I talk about post-processing. The basic difference between visible light and infrared photography is with visible light photography comes with some expectations on the part of your viewers or your audience. They kind of expect it to look like what their eye would see. And sometimes that's not always very fair, but that nonetheless is what you're dealing with when you're a visible light photographer. With infrared, there is no such expectation because you know from the outset that it's not going to resemble what your naked eye can see. And there's no rules that say what it should look like. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. It's also very forgiving, infrared is, because you can shoot in light and under conditions that really wouldn't work very well for visible light photography, like high noon on a sunny day. You know, there's a lot less contrast in infrared images than there is in visible light images. And so you can get away with a lot more than you could with your visible light camera. So did I mention it's really different? And it's not difficult. Yeah, there are some differences and you'll be able to master those. If you've come this far with your photography, far enough that you're sitting in this room today, the odds are you won't have any trouble mastering what we're going to be talking about. So moving on. How different is it? Well, here's an illustration. This is a visible light photo, first of all, and I mentioned this in my presentation last year, but I was asked last year to be the still photographer for a movie production. And the movie was about music and dance. This is the one and only character and actress in that movie. She's a dancer. And she's reenacting the story of Meropa, who was the youngest of the 7 sisters of the Pleiades, the star cluster that you see in the sky. And I was originally brought aboard just to document the production, but I planted some ideas in the director's head about doing infrared and also about doing some motion capture kind of photography at night. A lot of the shooting was done at night. And lo and behold, he picked up on those ideas. So he asked me to actually do a lot of shooting of the scenes in the action while they were being filmed with video. And so I actually spent a lot more time filming the action or shooting the action, and then I did documenting the production, and I did it in both visible and infrared light. And a significant number of my photos found their way into the final cut of the movie, so I was kind of proud about that. Yeah. But anyhow, this is what this particular scene looks like with a visible light camera at Red Rock Crossing. Taken a little while after sunset. So we're looking at, dusk light, blue hour light here. And the light's nice and soft and even. It's a nice scene. Looks pretty much like what your eye would have seen at that point in the proceedings. Here's almost the same scene in infrared. This was taken within a few minutes of the prior one, and she's now got wings on. But the lighting was basically the same, hadn't changed very much. This is actually an image where I post-processed to resemble that Kodak Aerochrome color infrared film, which means that's why the foliage is so orange. That's the typical look you get out of that film. And you can tweak that color to your heart's content, but this is kind of what that film would look like. And that's all well and good. You may or may not like this look, but if you don't, try this one. Processed quite differently. And next time I'll show you some of the details about how you do get these different looks. You can see that glow in the foliage.
That was
go ahead.
590?
This is a
Super color?
550 nanometer
550, okay.
filter.
That's-
Yeah,
That's a filter on a full spectrum now that you
Yeah.
have? Yeah.
that's correct. Yeah, it's my D800E converted to full spectrum, and I'll
Okay.
talk for those who may not be aware of
Sorry.
what that means. No, please don't be sorry. But I'll cover what that means in a little while as we talk about camera conversions. But anyhow, yeah, this is a D800E converted to full spectrum, which means that the actual passband of the camera is controlled by filters you put on the lens rather than on the sensor. And that's hugely flexible. I love it. So this is another look you can get out of that raw file, same one as the preceding one. And this doesn't, light your fire, then try this one. Yet another look. A little bit closer to the first one I showed, in that the foliage is a warm color again, but a much different, much more muted pinkish color. And if that one doesn't work for you, maybe this one would. Again, this is closer to the second one, but distinctly different. I actually prepared samples of this image, about, I don't know, 25 or 30 different samples of this one image for the director, and sent them to him just so we'd have an idea of the range of what was possible
What did he
in
choose?
infrared. And interestingly enough, what he chose was none of the ones I sent him. He chose a look that's much closer to what I was showing him on the back of my camera, unprocessed, as we were shooting. Because I guess that's what he expected,
Nice.
Did
Okay.
he see that one first before the ones you sent?
He did,
So
yeah,
he
that's-
was kind of primed.
Yep, he was, yeah. That wasn't my intent, of course.
Yeah.
But that's what he chose, and that's okay with me.
Yeah.
It worked, but anyhow. So, and then if you don't like color, try black and white.
Yeah. The texture is just.
Yeah, thank you. And here you can see again that glow in the foliage, which is very characteristic of black and white infrared films, of course, as Tim could probably attest. And it's easy to achieve in the digital realm as well. I noticed, by the way, there's a little carton of gear sitting at the edge, which I didn't notice until I was preparing these slides. But needless to say,
They always-
happens
They
to
always sneak in.
I would clone that out before
When
I
you
actually
have
shared.
the black and white, which
Sure.
is interesting.
Mhm.
What you also see is the glow of the sunset, isn't that what the glow off the mountain is?
There's sort of a
Almost.
halo around things
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, and it
And
picks that up sometimes.
I don't recall exactly how I did this black and white conversion. I'd have to go back and look at the file.
It just
But you-
picks up a lot more of that, and it's cool, that texture. There's nothing. I'm not being picky about it. I like
Mhm.
it.
Yeah,
But in black and whites, I've noticed that happens quite a bit. You
Mhm.
get that when you get that light that you never see with your naked eye.
yeah, you
But
get,
by golly, that infrared camera sees that light.
yeah, you get more contrast, or at least
You
you
do.
can get more contrast in the
Especially
black
through
and whites as
fog
well.
and.
If you go back to the color versions, you can see there's
You
no
can-
detail at all
yeah,
in
you
that
don't see
sky.
that. Mm.
Little
A
bit
little
there,
bit in
but
the very red one.
but
you
in
get
this
it.
one,
That
black and
one's-
white, there are actually clouds there still.
It's out, and also you get in, I've noticed in some of the ones of people that I've taken. It makes the fabric of the women's clothing look like silk.
Oh, yeah, it has more of a
Yeah.
sheen to it.
Because if you
yeah.
go back to your normal picture, she doesn't have a,
Well, she's-
that dress is that the same dress? She just.
It's the
she
same
just-
dress,
She
yeah.
just brought it up, but you don't
Yeah.
see the silky texture like you do there.
Well, you see that texture more in the wings than the skirt, but yeah, you're right, it certainly comes out in
Yeah,
black
it
and
picks
white.
out that sort of texture. It's
Yeah.
wonderful, yeah.
So, and there's a whole range of black and white looks you can get too. I don't have any more of them to show now, but believe me, there are lots of black and white looks you can get out of that raw file as well. So moving on, what can you shoot in infrared? And well, the short flip answer is just about anything. There's no rule that says you can't shoot anything you might want to in infrared. But in my experience, there are certain scenes and subjects that work noticeably well in infrared, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't try others. In fact, I encourage you to try others. But these are the ones that I have generally shot and generally work pretty well. First of all, landscapes, especially those with foliage. As I said, it tends to glow in infrared. Architecture, and that's a broad topic. It includes abandoned or run down homes and other buildings, as well as those that are, in good shape and continually used, and having some foliage in the scene also is a good thing. If you came to the Camera Club meeting last month, you saw some examples of that from Jim Haas. Some very, very impressive examples, actually.
Especially its architectural stuff.
Yeah, and it was very formal architecture stuff, the kind you'd seen in a glossy magazine or a real estate ad or something like that. But it was excellent work by for sure. And none of his included any foliage in the architecture images either. But anyhow, it was impressive. Old cars and trucks, those can look really interesting in infrared. And it helps to have some foliage in the picture too. City scenes like streets, parks, and gardens, and a bit of foliage in those often is the case, and that usually stands out. And yeah, did you notice any pattern there? Foliage really livens up infrared images almost without exception. And again, in post-processing, you can decide how much to emphasize that foliage. You can decide what tonality or what color to give it. The sky's the limit. And the foliage itself, not just as decoration in an image of something else, but the foliage itself can be a good subject too. I love shooting trees in infrared, for example. People. Infrared photos of people can be very flattering and very moving as well. And I have a few examples to show later. There are a couple of caveats as well, and remind me if I forget to mention them later as I'm showing the photos. But there are a couple of things you do have to watch out for or be prepared to retouch away when you're photographing people in infrared. Twilight and night sky scenes is another thing that works well. I'll elaborate a bit more on that in our next session. I'll make a point of choosing at least one night sky scene to show for as an example for post-processing. But the like the Hubble telescope and now more recently the Webb telescope those capture astronomical images in specific wavelengths. And the Webb in particular it's a giant infrared camera that's 1,000,000 miles away in space out there. And it gets amazing images that the Hubble can't get because it's infrared. And you can do some of the same things with your own camera sitting here on the face of the Earth. Obviously, the Webb telescope has a huge advantage because it's not dealing with an atmosphere. But nonetheless, you can, and I know someone, I haven't done too much of this myself, but John Gafford has a camera that he has converted to infrared. And he gets some amazing night sky photos, Milky Way photos with
I
that
was
camera.
wondering how the Milky Way looked different in the
Uh,
infrared
he-
versus the visible.
well, he brings out
It's a
more
different
colors.
thing.
Yeah,
It's a different thing.
he uses a filter over the lens that specifically emphasizes the hydrogen alpha band,
Right.
which is a band the stars emit a lot of. And so you can get a lot of color that way that you won't get with an ordinary visible light camera.
I shot the lunar eclipse.
Mm.
It was called the Harvest Lunar Eclipse that we had either this year or last year.
Mhm.
I shot it with my Canon R5 and my 100 to 500 lens. And then I put the filter and switched it to my Canon R infrared. And the infrared was a better picture than the R5
Mhm.
because of exactly what Jim was saying, and it was fantastic.
If you shoot something like the Orion Nebula
Oh, yeah,
with H alpha versus visible, it's totally different.
yeah.
That's
Totally
right.
different, you know, because you're just getting the emission line of hydrogen and alpha.
I even shot that, the
Which
comet
is the
that we
bulk,
had.
which is the bulk of the nebula, but
Mhm.
it's still.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that.
Yeah, the
But-
comet was the same. It was good. Yeah, I did it both ways.
But the other point is that there's more color, there's more variation of color across those astronomical
Mhm.
objects than you see with your naked eye or with a visible light
Visible.
camera. Also, so you can get colorful images and look up John's Facebook page, John
Yeah.
Gafford's Facebook page, you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'm gonna show a few examples and this is true confession time. I probably put too many examples in here.
Yeah.
I'll breeze through them pretty quickly. Don't hesitate to interrupt if you want to talk about any of them. But I did it there is a reason I put all these examples in because I just want to show you the amazing range of images you can get from a given kind of subject when you're shooting in infrared. So here we go. Starting with landscapes. This is the Point Pinos Lighthouse in Pacific Grove, California, which I shot back in June. And obviously with that Kodak aerochrome look to the image. This is shot with my 550 nanometer filter, which has become my favorite filter now for infrared, but not that I want to exclude the others. This is a tree house on the grounds of a coffee company, no pun intended, in Hawaii, in Kona, Hawaii, on the Big Island. And as you can see, the foliage glows in that one.
I have a picture of that too,
You do.
in regular camera, but that's not nicer.
This is very striking, yeah, and it wasn't a very interesting subject, at least with the lighting I had here with a visible light camera. This is the Catholic Church in Chimayo, New Mexico, sort of northeast of Santa Fe, between Santa Fe and Taos. And black and white version of it with lots of glow in that foliage. This is an old truck, which sadly isn't there anymore, but it's an old tow truck in Silverton, Colorado. This is a windmill along Dugas Road, south of here, between here and Phoenix. Focused with a 590 nanometer filter, or captured with 590 nanometers. This is a mansion in Beaufort, North Carolina. And I'm mispronouncing that. The way the locals pronounce it is Beaufort. But anyhow,
But that's long exposure. Is that?
well, that's what you're supposed to think. It actually wasn't, but I faked the long exposure in
Oh, you did.
Photoshop.
Like you're
I-
saying, neutral density.
I replaced the sky. I actually, those are the clouds that were there, but I used radial blur to blur them out in Photoshop and of course
You
mask the sky out
Clever
first.
guy, you.
Well, I just thought it would look more
It
interesting.
does, yeah.
You probably know where this is.
Yeah, we do.
I'm calling it a man-made thing because of the building, but
Uh,
obviously it has a bunch of natural stuff there too. This is an abandoned farmhouse in Utah. And
What lens did you use for that? Cause that's quite a good, you've got huge depth of field and it's all really sharp.
well, the depth of, thank you, but the depth of field is from focus bracketing, first of all. I captured the
Okay,
flowers in the
okay,
foreground and
okay.
then
Yeah,
a
yeah,
couple
yeah.
other
Yeah.
focus planes farther back.
Right,
It was probably my Nikon 28-300
okay.
millimeter lens because that lens
And then if you
is,
focus back, that's why you
Yeah.
got that, and yeah,
I'd have to go back and check the file to be sure about which lens it was, but I'm pretty sure that's the one.
that's a really nice. That's really
Well,
nice.
thank you. Thank you very much. This is an abandoned farm, actually two abandoned farmhouses north of Wilcox, Arizona, southeast Arizona. And this is actually from a camera club trip I led down there 3 or 4 years ago to the Chiricahua Mountains. And that's with the 590 nanometer filter. And with channel swapping, and I won't belabor that point now, but come next time and you'll hear all about channel swapping in post-processing. This is in Wilmington, North Carolina, historic old church there. And this is, if you notice, there's a little bit of curvature. This is made with a fisheye lens. But this is one of the cases I alluded to earlier, where you have a very harsh sunny day with very harsh lighting, but work just fine for infrared.
As long as it's behind you.
You don't want it, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it is true. Yeah, lens flare can be a real issue in infrared, so you need to watch out for that. This is an old barn in the foothills of the La Plata Mountains near Durango, Colorado, with a winter storm moving in, early winter storm. It was like October 1st or so, I think. This is from the Turkey Creek area, south of here.
It's
One of my favorite
also
hiking
amazing
places.
how much color comes out in agaves, isn't it? Or
In which, sorry?
how much color you can get out of tweaking the hues and
Oh, yeah.
to get the color out of the different cactus and agaves and stuff.
Yeah, and this one was interesting. I'll just a
'Cause
quick
it
little sidelight.
Absorbs a lot of different.
I struggled with the color when I was processing this one
I like that.
because I just somehow was having a hard time getting a blend of colors that I liked. And what I finally realized that got me past that issue was I was trying to get more difference between the yuccas in the foreground and everything else. And I was getting stuff that just looked ugly. And so finally I said, well, why fight it?
Yeah.
So I instead let the yuccas get closer to the color of the foliage.
Yeah.
And turned out that worked a lot better
Well,
to my eye.
it's real, and you got the red of the ground and everything.
Mhm, yeah.
That's hard to get. That's not
Yeah.
easy to get either.
It's
And
actually
blue skies. Well done, you.
nothing. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, that the soil here is actually redder than it is to your naked eye.
Yeah.
And that's certainly partly the result of the post-processing I did. But I like that skeletal tree in the
Oh,
middle.
yeah. It's
And
gorgeous.
I took steps, I burned that in a bit. to
Oh, you
darken it.
did. Okay. Well, we're gonna learn some processing tips, right?
Yeah, so they'll certainly talk about some of that. Okay, this is the Badlands in New Mexico. This is from the scouting trip back in May for the trip that I led last week or last couple of weeks. This is the Liebrook Badlands, which is not one of the areas that's well known. I was lucky to have a good guide to take me to this one and introduce me to it, which actually happened years ago, but nice to be there. And finally, This is a side canyon off of Lake Powell called Pool Canyon, and you can probably see why from the
Mm.
foreground. But this is actually a vertical panorama made with my first infrared camera, which was an ancient Nikon D200 with a 665 nanometer filter. And I'm a little proud of this one. It took second place in an international competition a number of years ago. And that just kind of proves you don't have to have today's latest and greatest technology in order to get good results with an infrared camera.
That's really good.
Yeah, thank you. This is a ridge above West Fork. I call it Gothic Ridge, but I processed it to give it that look. In this case, I took away the glow from the foliage in post-processing. You can still see a little bit of it in this ponderosa in the lower right here. But I wanted the trees to look more like silhouettes. And the image, as is often the case, it kind of led me in this direction too. Right? There's a lot of trial and error involved in processing these things. And it gradually, you try something and you like it a little bit, and then you try something else and you like it a little bit more. And finally you get something that you really like. And that's what happened with this one. And this one took first place in an international competition a number of years ago. This is the coxcomb, just west of Sedona.
Oh, what a good idea to isolate that. Wow.
And with the moon in the sky, this is like 10 a.m. or so in November, I guess. I was on a hike. And if you look at a bigger print of this image, you can count the craters in the moon in that image.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because infrared light cuts through the haze in the atmosphere better than visible light does. There's more detail in that moon. That's why the James Webb Telescope works so well, because it can see through the dust clouds that are between it and the objects, billions of light years away that it's looking at.
It
Sorry,
kind of
go
makes
ahead.
it look like
No.
a three-dimensional object too.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that was the difference between that lunar harvest moon between the R5 and the R with the infrared. It sees into the moon as opposed to just, you saw the surface and you knew that it deserved, but that other infrared picture is a much better picture. And they were both with the diamond rings, so it was a good one. That's who. You are so clever. Who would think to take the coxcomb like that and isolate one of, oh my gosh.
Well, there used to be a trail. There used to be a trail that went along the east side of the
Yes.
coxcomb, right at the
Yeah.
base. Sadly, that's now been obliterated by a subdivision. But I was hiking on that trail with a couple of buddies, and I just looked up and I saw that moon kind of settling over the rocks. And he said, "You guys go on ahead. I'm going to bushwhack up the hill here and get some shots." And this was the result.
Wow, that's just.
So is that one focus stacked or bracketed or?
It's focus stacked. Yeah, the moon, it's an honest image of the moon. It's not really a composite in the usual sense, because the moon actually was there, but I was using a long lens, and so I couldn't get the rocks and the moon in focus
No, so
simultaneously.
you wouldn't, yeah.
So I focused on the rocks, moved, took a shot, quickly focused on the moon and took another shot.
That's just fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, no wonder you won on that one.
Yeah, it's pretty highly regarded.
Oh, wow.
This is an example of one thing I do, and my style for post-processing infrared has evolved over the years. And I started out doing mostly black and white. Then I started doing more and more color. And now I've kind of migrated back in the direction of black and white sometimes, but usually not pure black and white. What I'll do is I'll convert an image to black and white, and then I'll take the original image in color and overlay it on top in a new Photoshop layer and change the blend mode to color, and then back off the opacity quite a bit. So you have a little bit of color in there, and I'll tweak that color. You can move the color all around the spectrum, of course, in the process. But so I just add a little bit of color back, and I generally find that looks more lively than a pure black and white.
What a good idea.
So
We're gonna learn
I
this too, Jim?
See, you already did. I just told you.
No,
But-
Not exactly.
Yeah, I'll give you a demo. Of that. Yeah, I'll give a demo next time. But yeah, I like doing it that way, and it lets you preserve the merits of the black and white image, where
Yeah.
you have more control over tonality,
And green.
shadows, and that sort of thing. But still put a little life into it that a black and white image might not have. So this is from the Chapel Trail, not far from here at all. That's Cathedral Rock in the background, but this is with a very wide angle lens. So you don't see too much of it, but I just like the way all that different kinds of, all the different kinds of foliage added its own tonality, its own glow to this image. And this is, if you drive from here to Cornville via Cornville Road, when you come over, I'm sorry, to Cottonwood, when you come over the hill above Cornville, so you're now looking down into Cottonwood, this is what I saw one day a couple years ago during the monsoon season. Wow. And that storm was just moving in over Jerome, actually. That's from, there's a famous tree that everybody loves to shoot on Upper Red Rock Loop Road. That's the tree. A couple years ago during monsoon.
Oh, no,
season.
that's a different look through that tree, isn't it? Yeah,
Mhm.
I've shot that
What
tree a
time
million
of day
times,
is
but I haven't shot that shot.
This was late afternoon with a monsoon storm kind of moving in and out and beams of light breaking through the
Gosh,
clouds.
that light is fabulous.
Yeah, it was. It was very cooperative. This is more foothills of the La Plata Mountains in Colorado, and it's not one of my favorite images. I just put it in here because it kind of illustrates, you know, what you can do with foliage and with images of storm clouds together in a photo. That's about 3 miles into West Fork, right at the point where you have to start wading if you want to go any farther. So it's right near there.
I know where I have to stop usually. Yeah.
And yeah, that's where I always stop. But it's this is again that aerochrome sort of look. You know, when you hike West Fork, one of the mistakes a lot of people make is they never look up. And there's a lot of amazing stuff up on the rim of West Fork Canyon.
All those lines that you get and the infrared really highlight all of the crags and the bits. That's really cool stuff.
Yeah, and I emphasize those in post-processing too. I wanted
Yeah.
those to come out a bit. And there are plenty of tools around these days that let you do that sort of thing. All right, I'm just about out of landscapes here. This is SP Crater about 30 miles north of Flagstaff. And I don't actually know if the tree or the volcano is the subject of this photo, but you can take your pick.
Again, got the glow, doesn't it?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
definitely does. This is also in the Turkey Creek area. There's a side trail that takes you up a ridge, and then you get to see Geronimo here.
Oh.
It's a profile of
yes.
Geronimo that Mother Nature has kindly provided for us. And this is from Sunset Crater, the lava flow around Sunset Crater.
It loves Sunset Crater, infrared.
It loves the contrast between the foliage and the lava.
And the lava,
basically,
yeah, I've taken billions up there, it just loves it, all these different colors, oh, yeah.
That works well, I agree. And you know where this is again, different view of Crescent Moon Ranch. This is actually made in the fall. These were fall colors, except I turned them into black and white and then toned them by adding in just a little bit of the original color from the raw image. Okay, this is Mammoth Hot Springs in Yellowstone. You can even see the steam coming out of the hot springs under the trees.
And the salt is a salt, isn't it?
It's
absorb much.
It's minerals.
Yeah, the minerals.
Yeah, it's got salt in it, but it's dense mineral deposits. It's a very otherworldly place.
Cool.
This is a twilight shot at the south rim from just last winter, I guess it was, or maybe a year ago in the winter. This was like 15 or 20 minutes after sunset, so it was actually getting fairly dark. But and I had no idea what I was going to capture or what I was capturing in infrared when I took this shot.
How high was your ISO on that?
I don't recall offhand, but I'm sure it was elevated 800 or higher. It was long exposure too, so
Oh, okay.
it was on a
okay.
tripod and it's
Yeah.
a longer exposure, so it may not have been ISO that high, but I don't recall. And this is from the trip last week to Colorado and New Mexico. This is the alien throne in the Badlands of New Mexico
Gosh.
with a little Milky Way behind it. And this one is actually, strictly speaking, not an infrared image. It was made with my full spectrum camera that captures everything it's capable of, ultraviolet, infrared, and visible light. But there's definitely infrared contributing here.
Mm.
And that's something I haven't experimented too much with, and I intend to do a lot more of it.
So no filter, just,
No filter over the
Just
lens at
your-
all, yeah,
yeah,
just the
Just the-
full spectrum converted
take it
camera.
out, yeah,
Mhm.
okay.
And it's a composite because you couldn't, the image of the rocks was captured before it was completely dark during
Right.
blue hour. And then the image of the Milky Way was captured later when it was completely dark.
I haven't felt comfortable with just doing full spectrum, so I'm really quite interested in techniques for doing that.
I've tried it a bit. I
Have you?
don't have
Yeah.
any other examples of it in the package here.
Cause it's supposed to be quite good, actually, but
Well-
I haven't been able to figure out what to try.
Well, what I've
Yeah.
found is the colors actually tend to be more muted
I
when you
think-
shoot full spectrum
Yeah,
than with most filters you'd put over the lens.
Will adding contrast in post help?
Oh, yeah, it can.
Yeah.
And one image I've shared publicly, I did exactly that. I did some processing to bring out the colors. But I haven't played with it enough really to speak very intelligently about it. I'm sure there are lots of possibilities. But I don't know what they are until I try
I'll
it a
just
little
have
more.
to try it a little bit more. 'Cause
That's
that's
right.
quite good.
Now, people,
Ah,
I have a series of infrared images of people. This is John Oakes, a dear friend of mine who's a painter and a retired art professor from Western Kentucky University. And I'll talk a little bit about the characteristics, the infrared characteristics of this image. It tends to put a glow on skin, just like it does on foliage, first of all. And that can be a good thing. It also tends to de-emphasize things like blemishes and pimples and wrinkles and things. And of course, people can appreciate that sometimes.
yes,
Hello.
it takes about 10 years of, yeah, it's a,
But it also, there's more to it than that, just those technical details, I think. It brings this image of him to life. I should have brought, this was from, I'm doing a whole series of photos of artist friends while they're working, while they're concentrating on their work. And they're very moving images, the ones I've done so far. I really love doing that. And I want to do a lot more of it. And I always shoot them both in infrared and visible light. And I like both. There's no strong preference for one versus the other, but the results are certainly different. In visible light, he's actually wearing a rather dark shirt, for example. But in infrared, you know, the dye, some of the dyes they use in clothing emit a lot of infrared light, which you never see with your eyes. But like your dark t-shirt there, John, I'll bet that would have a blue glow in infrared. It would have a lot more glow to it than it does in the light we're in, you know, to our naked eyes. So that's one characteristic of infrared. And not only does it alter the color of clothing, but it alters the appearance of skin. His arm in particular looks a lot younger than it really is. His face does too. This is Ted Grussing, who some of you probably know, or at least know of, a very well-known photographer, but he's also a jeweler and gem cutter, and that's what he's working on here. And captured in infrared. all these images that I'm doing of the artist, by the way, I'm doing them all in black and white. I don't know if I'll ever do color versions of any of the images of them because,
I did some color and I got some super results.
oh, yeah.
I did a
In infrared.
model, I did
Yeah.
a model shoot.
Oh, yeah,
This
I have,
summer.
yeah, I'll show you some of those. I
And,
have a few of those
oh,
in here too.
The people were absolutely over the moon with that because they
Mhm.
couldn't believe how young they looked.
Yep. Let's see, this is a model from a session in Jerome a few years ago, shot with studio lights.
Is that person you draw? Looks like it.
Her name is Kiaki.
Cause John draws somebody who looks like. that.
Oh, do you go to Zushka's sessions up there?
Used to.
Oh, okay, yeah. This was she used to do photo sessions too, and she has stopped doing those a few years ago, sadly, but they were good. some
He
of
did
them.
the life drawing stuff.
Yeah. This is
Oh.
a
Gosh,
17-year-old girl. She's,
Wow.
this was 6 or 7 years ago.
she looks like 8, doesn't
Yeah, she does. Well, that, again, that's that
Yeah,
glow from the
yeah.
infrared, you know, the look of her skin.
Uh-huh.
You'd never guess it from this photo, but her hair is a natural flaming red.
Yeah,
But, it gives this image, it has sort of that high key look, you know.
Mm.
The tones are light and muted, except for the eyes, which are nice and dark and penetrating. What's next? Oh, another model shoot from Jerome. Again, showing that glow on the skin
yeah,
from infrared.
it really, I think it works really well.
Got it, yeah. This is a park in Wilmington, North Carolina. And this was just a grab shot. I was walking with my brother and sister-in-law in the other direction, walking out of this image. And I just turned around and grabbed this shot of these people after we had passed them. I kind of liked it.
Mhm.
Or something, you know, looks like somebody marching into her future or something there.
Yeah.
This is another model. This is from a model shoot also at the Jerome High School. And this was lit with window light, nothing but window light.
Yeah,
But again, you see that infrared glow on the
Mhm.
skin, and it actually softens the hair too. You saw that in that earlier shot of the redhead.
Yeah, it still keeps the definition.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, if I process this in color, in a lot of cases, for some reason, hair comes out sort of blue. If you process it in color.
But anymore today, it's not right.
That's yeah, that's true. Looks perfectly normal. This is Ruth Waddell, who
oh.
was
gosh.
considered to be
We
the
just
matriarch
lost her.
of the Sedona arts community. Yeah, I was able to shoot her back in June, and
Oh,
sadly, she
geez.
died a couple months later.
She was such a.
She was 97 years old
Wow.
and still moderately active as an artist. She's working
Yeah.
on pastels right here.
Oh, what a capture that is, gosh.
So that's what people look like.
Oh,
So
gosh.
any questions or discussion at this point? We're close to an hour into our session here, and it might be a good time for a break, but any comments or questions or
Perceiving
ideas? Mhm.
the colors when you're taking the infrared, is that something that's hard to do? I mean,
Well, that's a good question. And it depends on what type of camera you're using, first of all. With a digital SLR, you're still looking through the lens directly. So the only thing you'll ever see is what your eye sees, you know, visible light. If you put the camera in live view mode, then you can see what the sensor is seeing.
okay.
So that's
good.
one way to see what the camera is actually capturing. But other than that, all you're seeing is visible light. And if you have a filter over the lens that blocks visible light, then you're seeing pretty much nothing through the viewfinder. I sometimes use a 665 or 720 nanometer filter over the lens on my full spectrum camera. And if you really look hard and block incident light from around your eye, you can still vaguely make out an image in the viewfinder,
But if
but
you
it's not
have,
easy.
if you have a mirrorless camera,
Yeah.
what you see is what you get.
Yeah, that's
You're
Well,
seeing,
I don't even know what that is.
you're seeing what the sensor.
well, the sensor
Yeah.
is.
Here, I'll
The
give you
new
the
mirror,
short,
yeah.
I'll give you the short answer. A mirrorless camera is like a DSLR in live view mode.
Yeah,
That's what you're seeing.
there you go. That's
Except
what it is.
that with a mirrorless camera, you can also see that through the viewfinder
Yeah.
because it has a little LCD screen
Mhm.
that you see through the viewfinder
Yeah.
that's separate from the one on the
There-
back of your
There's
camera.
no mirrors.
But yeah, there's no mirror.
Yeah.
So that's actually advantageous potentially for infrared. A mirrorless camera is for two or three reasons.
Yeah.
I'll actually touch upon it later, but in a nutshell, a DSLR uses a separate sensor for metering and a separate one for autofocus. It doesn't use the sensor in the camera because that's blocked by the mirror when you're actually looking through the viewfinder. So that means there are potential differences between what the camera will record and what it's actually metering or focusing on. And that can cause problems when you have a camera that's converted for a DSLR that's converted for infrared. So I'll touch more on that one a little later. But with a mirrorless camera, you don't have that disadvantage because it does all of its metering and focusing with the actual sensor in the camera. So there should be fewer focus issues and potentially fewer exposure issues as well because of that.
But now you've done all these images with the DSLR.
Correct, yeah.
So have you run into that issue?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
yes.
And what do you do when you see it?
You look at your histogram and you look at your LCD screen and then you correct it and shoot the image again.
Yeah.
That's what I was
Basically.
gonna, next question was the histogram,
Yeah, histogram, absolutely essential, yes.
especially in the red spectrum.
Well, that's interesting. I don't have examples to show you here, but if you have it's true that it's probably the red pixels on your sensor that capture more infrared light than the others do, but not exclusively. You'll see a signal in the green and the blue pixels as well, green and the blue curves on your histogram as well as the red one. And the balance between those three channels varies depending on which filter you're using.
You probably don't want the red channel to even come close to hitting on the right side.
No, it's a little more nuanced than that.
Okay.
I'll talk about this a
Okay.
lot more next
That's
time
fine.
when we talk about
Sure.
how to shoot and evaluate your images.
Okay.
But actually, in my experience, in a lot of cases, when you look at the histogram on an infrared image, especially one from a higher contrast scene, like a sunny day or something, you'll see pixels banging up against both edges of it. And yet, when you convert that raw file, they look just fine. And I have my theory as to why that is. I'll elaborate more next time when we talk about it.
That sounds good.
But yeah, not only the one thing I'll say is that with infrared shooting, it's not only more forgiving in terms of what kinds of scenes or what kinds of lighting you can shoot with, it's also more forgiving in the sense that even if your raw file looks less than ideal because it's got blocked up shadows or overblown highlights, or appears to anyway, in a surprising number of cases, when you actually process the raw files, that doesn't bother you. It's somehow, but one thing, Adobe Camera Raw, this is more detail than I was planning on talking about, but Adobe Camera Raw years ago actually introduced a feature underneath the hood that they don't even talk about or advertise, which they should, because it's very useful. But if one of your color channels is blown out in areas in your image, it attempts to recover that color channel by extrapolating from the other two color channels. And so you can take an image where on the histogram on your camera, you get the blinkies and you get pixels that look like they're seriously blown out. Sometimes when you convert that raw file in Photoshop or Lightroom, it'll recover those blown out highlights for you.
Wow.
So it's pretty nice, yeah.
Yeah.
You probably don't even know that's happening sometimes.
No,
when it's doing it, but
I'm just real careful on that red channel.
yeah, I tend to be as well. But next time I'll try and make a point of showing you histograms from some infrared images from my cameras. And I think you'll see what I'm talking about. But and again, depending on the filter you use, what you'll see in the histogram on your camera is sometimes the color channels be spread out a lot. You'll see all the blues at one end of the histogram and all the reds at the other, and or all the greens, and they'll be banging up, or they'll look like they're past the clipping point.
Yeah.
But when you process the raw file, they actually behave themselves and come back into range.
Yeah, I guess you would notice that more on infrared versus the.
I think that's true. Yeah, it's true. I mean, if you get an ugly looking histogram with a visible light camera, it's harder to recover what you lost at either end of the tonal range. So if nobody needs a break, I guess we can proceed here.
I was falling asleep a little bit.
Oh, well, hey, Larry, give him a nudge if you need. Okay, so going back to the very beginning here, what the heck is infrared light anyway? Well, here's a picture that kind of illustrates where it fits in the grand scheme of things with electromagnetic radiation. And you all heard of all these terms before, of course, whether you've ever put them in place along a spectrum like this, you may or may not have. But you've all heard about radio waves, for example, all your lives, and that those are very long waves, very low frequency low frequency part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And as you raise the frequencies more, hey, you made it. Come on in. Find a chair for this lady. Not a problem at all. Actually, you've come in at an opportune moment because we just got past all of the introductory stuff I was going to talk about, and now we're jumping into the meat a little bit more. This is Janet, by the way.
Hey, Janet.
And there's a sign-up sheet somewhere. I'll ask you to sign that for us, Janet. So if we progress up the electromagnetic spectrum, up in frequency or down in wavelength, we go to shorter and shorter wavelengths, and eventually we get past the FM band here, and the TV broadcast band is right in here as well. It extends into the microwave range a bit. But then we get up into microwaves, and that's where you find cell phone signals and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and that sort of stuff, among other things. And then beyond microwaves is infrared. And infrared basically means longer than red or below red in the spectrum. Whoops, sorry, I'm accidentally clicked there. And so infrared is a range of light that we can't see, basically, and most creatures on Earth can't. There are some creatures that can see in infrared, birds and bees, for example. They like to find flowers, and sometimes they can find flowers better in infrared than they can with visible light. So some creatures can see a little bit of infrared, but not us. Anyway, so, oh, and by the way, one point of confusion about infrared photography and infrared cameras, people often ask me, when you're shooting infrared, are you capturing, body heat? And the answer is no. The night vision cameras that police and soldiers use and stuff, those use the longer end of the infrared wavelength spectrum here. And our cameras can only capture the shorter wavelength end of that spectrum. So the body, the heat sensitive cameras and the infrared light cameras that we're going to be using, those don't actually overlap much at all in terms of what they can capture. Okay, so finally we get past infrared, we get into the visible spectrum, and you've all seen this many times, I'm sure. At the red end of the spectrum, the long wavelength end, the wavelengths are about 700 nanometers, and you don't have to go very far up this grand scale here to get to the shortest wavelengths that we can see, which is the violet end of the spectrum at 400 nanometers. So our visible portion of the spectrum really is not a very large portion of all of the electromagnetic spectrum in the grand scheme of things. Beyond the violet end of the visible spectrum is ultraviolet, And our camera sensors can capture some of this ultraviolet, the nearer portion of it, as well as the nearer portion of the infrared spectrum. So as we talked a little bit about before the session got started, when they manufacture cameras, they actually have to put a filter over the sensor to block ultraviolet and infrared, because otherwise that would distort the colors you see in the image. So moving on then, beyond ultraviolet, we have X-rays and gamma rays, and those three get increasingly dangerous, as you probably know. Apart from the fact that a full spectrum camera can capture some infrared, they're not really very pertinent to what we're talking about today, so I won't belabor that any further. But anyhow, that's where the visible spectrum fits in and where infrared and ultraviolet sits relative to our visible spectrum. The one other point I'll make, though, as I talk about cameras, is when you convert a camera, you have a choice of filters. And whoops.
Flag staff and joint surgery start. Surgery tomorrow.
Oh, you do? Okay, go ahead. Can you get through? Mute my phone, which I forgot to do earlier. Okay. We're going to come back to discussion of the spectrum a little bit in a little while when we start talking about converting cameras, because you have to choose a filter when you get a camera, whether you buy a camera that's already converted or get one of your own converted to infrared. And you can get filters that basically block all visible light and only pass infrared, or you can get filters that pass various portions of the visible spectrum in addition to infrared. Those are all different. They give you somewhat different looking images, and it's possible to agonize a lot about which one you should actually get. I hope I can relieve you of some of that agony, because it's actually less important than you might think because of all the flexibility you have in post-processing. But it's worth thinking about and understanding where those different cutoff wavelengths fit in the visible spectrum. So we'll come back to that. So, what are we getting first? All right, so what is infrared photography then, really? Well, in a nutshell, it's a translation process. You're taking a foreign language and translating it into one you understand. Specifically, you're taking light you can't see and translating that into light you can see. You're just shifting wavelengths around, basically, or really translating wavelengths. So the nice thing about that is that there's no Rosetta Stone for that translation. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. There's no rules that govern what you can and can't do, which means you can do anything, literally. The range of possibilities is enormous. And as I say here, everything is fair game. Gives you lots and lots of, it can be a bewildering range of choices. You have to watch out not to get overwhelmed by it all. But you have just enormous amounts of latitude in terms of the final look you will get out of any given infrared image. I illustrated some of that earlier. And it's good to sort of have it. Well, sometimes I'll back off from that statement a little bit. It's good to have a starting point in mind, something you try initially, and so that serves as your starting point for future processing of the image. But it's not necessarily good to have a conception of what you want the final result to look like. Maybe you do, and maybe that works, but not in every case. There are times where I've started processing an image and just gotten more and more frustrated because I haven't liked what I was getting. And then I kind of back off and go a totally different direction and find that actually leads me somewhere. So don't jump into it with any particular preconceptions is my basic advice. Any imaginable color scheme or tonal range in black and white, and actually tonal schemes apply in color too, they're allowed and they're encouraged. Give it a try, see what happens. You might be pleasantly surprised. Okay, any questions at this point? That's okay. Not a problem. If there are no questions at this point, I will move on and talk about cameras. You can capture infrared light with almost any camera, and that's film or digital. If you try and capture it with an unconverted digital camera, you'll immediately run into a problem because there's a filter over the sensor that's trying to block infrared light. If you put a filter over the lens that passes infrared light, then those two filters are fighting each other. But people do that sometimes. It requires really long exposures because very little light ultimately gets through. But there are people that do that. I don't recommend it. I've never tried it myself. But it does happen. With film cameras, which we're not going to talk about anymore, all you got to do is put infrared film in the camera and presto, you have an infrared camera. And you can, that'll be optional, I presume, but
Yes, it is.
but yeah, I mean, with a film camera, you can convert that to an infrared camera by just putting infrared film in it. Not all the lenses worked very well. There are some complications there. In my humble opinion, film is totally obsolete. I shot my last roll around, I don't know, 18 years or so ago. And I can assure you it was my last roll. But there are people who still shoot film, and I don't actually even know how much infrared film is still being made.
I don't even know if you can still buy it or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure. There are people, there are people who have hoarded old stocks of long discontinued film,
Yeah.
and they sell them, and there's a whole marketplace and a whole community
And they're
around
with
that.
something that could be outdated even if it's in the refrigerator.
Yeah, right. But anyhow, well, that's out of scope for this session. Okay, so almost any digital camera can be converted to infrared. I recommend either DSLR or mirrorless cameras. Point and shoot cameras can work, but the problem is that if you take a point and shoot camera and convert it to infrared, you're still stuck with whatever lens is on that camera. You can't change the lens, and some lenses don't work well for infrared. So unless you have pretty good knowledge that somebody else has already converted that camera model with the lens it has and gotten good results, I don't recommend you try it. But if you have a lens that does work well, I've certainly seen people show images made with point and shoot cameras that were converted. And in fact, some of the companies that do conversions will convert point and shoot cameras or sell you a pre-converted point and shoot camera. So it's not out of the question. But DSLR and mirrorless are the ones you can be pretty much assured will work. And those are what I would recommend. As I mentioned, you can put an IR filter over the lens on an unconverted camera, but not recommended. I won't belabor that anymore. Converting digital cameras. I already covered this a little bit, but digital sensors naturally respond to some infrared and ultraviolet light as well as visible. So cameras are made with filters to block that light over the sensor. And so for a camera to record infrared, all you got to do is have someone remove that filter and replace it with one that passes infrared. And you can have, we've already talked about this, but you can also have it converted to what they call the full spectrum filter, which means it's clear. It passes all of the light that your sensor is capable of recording. And that is flexible because you can then use different cutoff wavelengths with that camera. You can put different filters on the lens to get different cutoff wavelengths. And as we touched on briefly, I guess before the session started, you can even put a filter that mimics the original filter that was on your sensor. So that camera can still function as a visible light camera if you wanted to. It can be your backup body for your regular visible light camera, for example. Adding a filter, of course, puts another piece of glass in the light path, so that can have negative effects on your image quality, but I haven't had much trouble with that myself so far, but it is a potential factor. Actually, I have one filter that doesn't work well with wide angle lenses because it's just not high enough quality glass, basically. Okay, so converting a camera. There are various companies that offer infrared conversions. There are three, I have the links to them and stuff later in the package. But there are three that I can recommend without reservation. LifePixel, Kolari Vision, and Spencer's are the three companies. They all offer a wide variety of filters and options. I think all three of them actually sell pre-converted cameras. All three of them have websites that have all sorts of tutorials and information about infrared photography. And as far as I know, they all do excellent work. I've had cameras converted by two of those, LifePixel and Kolari Vision, and had no trouble with those cameras. And John Gafford's camera was converted by Spencer's, and it works fine for him. He can recommend them.
LifePixel, I can recommend them.
But when you get a camera converted, or when you choose one to buy, you do have to specify what filter you're going to use. And there's a whole list of filter choices on this slide that talk about what the differences are in those filters to some degree. And I'll point out, if you go to the websites of those companies, especially LifePixel and Kolari Vision, they have lots of examples there and lots of images. Kolari Vision actually publishes response curves for all of their filters on their website, so you can see exactly what the shape of the cutoff curve is in their filters. That's kind of nice. But there's all kinds of information about there, plus a lot of other sites. If you just do a search for infrared photography and that sort of thing, you'll find a whole huge wealth of information out there. Most of it reliable, but not all of it. But just briefly, basically the list of filters here is in order of their wavelength, with the longest wavelength cutoff listed first. And that's the one you actually have, Larry, right? 830?
I have an 830 filter, I have a 720 camera.
Oh, okay. All right. So 830 and 720 are filters which both basically block all visible light, almost all. And the 830 in particular, it's far enough into the infrared spectrum that very little visible light gets through. And what that means is that there's very little color in the raw file, very little color information in the raw file from that camera. So that's used almost exclusively for black and white images. It's really hard to get any color out of those images with that filter. 720 is right at the edge between visible and infrared light. And some color does get through. I have firsthand experience there. I've actually produced color images with a 720 nanometer filter on my lens, and I've seen plenty of other examples posted as well. But it's kind of tough to squeeze the color out of those images, but it can be done. And then the next several filters in the list pass progressively more of the visible spectrum, and you get progressively richer colors out of those filters. One of the companies called LifePixel, in the information they post about the filter choices, they say that 590 is probably the best filter choice if you want to be able to get the widest possible range of different looks out of your camera. I don't know if I agree with that anymore, but that's what they say. But then they show examples where the 590 nanometer images can be post-processed to look like any of those from the longer wavelengths. So there is plenty of flexibility there. But my new favorite filter, the one I use more than any other now, is 550. And that passes even a little bit more visible light. You get even more color. And it's still really flexible. You can get excellent black and white images from it, as well as color. 490, that's a filter which LifePixel is selling, and they recommend it if you want to capture color pictures of people that have realistic looking flesh tones. They recommend a 490 nanometer filter because I guess that passes basically all of the light, the warmer colors of the spectrum that put a little bit of color on human skin. So that's what they recommend. And then there are some specialized filters here. IR Chrome is what they call it. It mimics Kodak's Aerochrome color film, or Aerochrome color infrared film. It's a slide film, it was a slide film. And does a pretty good job right out of the camera. You don't have to do a lot of processing to mimic the aerochrome look with that filter. I don't have one because you can also do that in post-processing. And then there's one they call super blue, which I haven't tried, but it passes blue light in addition to infrared. So you can get blue skies in an infrared, color infrared photo. And some people like that. Again, you can do pretty much the same thing in post-processing in my experience, so I haven't bothered trying one of those. And as I've mentioned, full spectrum passes everything your sensor is capable of. So how do you choose? Well,
There you go. Number one question.
yeah. And there, I can give you two suggested answers for that. If you want a lot of flexibility, choose either 590 or 550 as your cutoff point when you get a camera converted or purchase a camera. Because it does give you the opportunity to mimic the looks of these longer wavelength filters in post-processing. And you can also mimic the aerochrome look as well. And you can even get images that represent the super blue look pretty well too. So that's one suggestion. Choose one of those two cutoff wavelengths. The other suggestion is choose full spectrum, which gives you the most flexibility of all, because then it's you choose your filter by putting it over your lens, and you can change those filters easily. And they're actually now for mirrorless cameras, Kalari Vision is also selling a line of filters for certain lens mounts, Canon and Sony and Nikon, I believe, for mirrorless cameras that you insert in the lens mount behind the lens. And that's actually an advantageous because that works with any lens. You don't have to worry about the filter thread sizes or anything.
So,
That works with any lens that fits on that lens mount.
so here's a question.
Mhm.
So what can you then use to protect the glass on your lens? Because you can't obviously
You
use
can-
the old UV light.
Yeah, they sell clear glass filters.
Can you?
Yeah, I don't know much about them because I've never tried to use one, but they do
Yeah.
sell clear glass filters that you can still screw on your lens.
You can.
And
okay.
they also sell UV filters that block ultraviolet light. And for most cases, if you're trying to shoot infrared, normally ultraviolet light is kind of ugly, actually, I'll say it differently. The images you get when capturing ultraviolet light can be kind of ugly, and that's especially true when you're photographing people. I can tell you that because I have seen examples and I've even tried it a little bit. So there's generally no harm done if you block ultraviolet light.
So if you still use that UV filter, you think it still works?
Give it a
Okay.
try, but yeah, I think that would be the case.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because there's an adapter that you can use on the EOS R
Mhm.
to use non-RF lenses.
Yeah.
So because I do one of my favorite lenses to use is the wide angle
Mhm.
2.8 16-35. I use that buckets of time, but you can use, instead of the adapter I have, I can get the different adapter which allows you to use I'd like to do that,
Mhm.
but then I was thinking, how do I protect my glass on my other lenses?
Yeah,
And now I've got a whole bunch of EF lenses I could use with the R.
Yeah.
For that.
I think
Okay.
you'd be perfectly fine putting an ultraviolet filter over the lens.
I
don't
can
think that
easily
would-
try that
Yeah.
pretty easily.
Unless you,
right now.
excuse me, unless you explicitly want to capture ultraviolet light, I don't think there's any harm from putting that.
Well, when I
ultraviolet
was
filter
looking
on
at
the
your
lens.
chart, I'm
Mhm.
not sure that you really need to capture UV light.
The
They
only.
do talk about that, you know, you do it in the
Yeah.
blogs and stuff. They do say you don't want to put UV with an infrared camera, but
Mhm.
I haven't been able to get a clear answer to that.
To the best of my knowledge, the most common and beneficial use of ultraviolet light cameras is for forensic purposes. They reveal blood stains and fingerprints and things like that. I guess they use ultraviolet lights and use fluorescence or something. I don't know the details there, but that's one place they're used is in, detective agencies and police departments and such.
Well, and the 490 is gonna get a whole lot of the visible spectrum anyway.
Yeah, that's
'Cause,
true.
You get up to 400 and that's.
That's the end of the visible spectrum, yeah.
Yeah.
So you've pretty well gotten yourself all the way into the.
You're blocking the blue end of the spectrum still, the
Yeah,
490
which-
filter,
yeah.
but that's all, yeah. So,
Well,
so
thanks.
yeah, I'm fairly sure that if you put an ultraviolet filter over your, an ultraviolet blocking filter, a haze filter, basically over
Yeah.
your lens, you won't notice any difference in your infrared work.
Well.
Let me know how it goes.
I will,
Try.
yeah, I was gonna call Hunt and
Yeah,
ask him about the clear glass too.
If you
so.
like black and white,
Mhm.
shooting in that 830 nanometer range is wonderful because there's almost no post processing required.
Oh,
Black
yeah.
and white
Ah.
images. They
Yep.
can be very stunning.
Okay, thanks. That's a good
That's a
tip.
good tip.
And one
Good
of
thing to know about.
you mentioned the Kalari Vision,
Mhm.
the little insert.
Mhm.
Okay, those are only for full size processors.
Full frame
Yeah, full
cameras, yeah.
frames.
Okay.
If you have a DX, it's.
Really? Even an X mount or a Z mount DX? They don't work?
It has to be, well, has to be Nikon Z.
Mhm.
I don't think they do it for, no, they do not do it for a DLSS.
Oh, yeah, they don't.
All mirrorless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And full size.
Right, I don't know of anybody who does that for DSLRs, because the mounts
They
are
don't.
different and I think
The
basically,
mirror would-
yeah, the mirror is too close to where the filter would be.
Right.
I think that's right. But as far as I know, the Kalari Vision, behind the lens drop-in filters should work for DX mirrorless cameras as well as FX. I don't know that for sure,
Okay.
but I'm
I
sure.
was told it didn't,
Oh, okay,
but
well,
I'm
it's probably documented on Kalari Vision's website,
Oh,
they
sure
should tell
will
you,
be.
but. I don't know why that would be, because the lens mount is actually identical. You can put a DX lens on an FX camera. And the camera will automatically switch to DX mode on the sensor, but the lens will still work. Tim, go ahead.
Okay, if you had a 590
Mhm.
nanometer. And you wanted to get something to appear like the 830, you
Mhm.
do that in post.
Or you can put an 830 filter over
Or
the
you can put
lens.
it, okay.
Yeah.
So same with full spectrum, if you wanted to full spectrum to get 830, it's a filter.
Yeah. Basically, the way it works, all of these filters, except the specialized ones at the bottom, but all of these filters basically pass all infrared light, so they have a pass band where the response is up here, and then at some cutoff wavelength, the response drops down to almost zero, and anything shorter, any wavelength shorter than that, don't get passed. So if your camera is, for example, a 590 nanometer camera, and you want to get infrared images with a longer wavelength filter, you can do that because those filters don't fight each other. If you put a 720 nanometer filter over the lens of your 590 nanometer camera, that 720 nanometer filter will now block the red end of the visible spectrum, but everything else, all the infrared light still gets through.
Okay.
You can't put a shorter wavelength filter over your camera because the one on your sensor is still fighting those shorter wavelengths. It's still blocking those shorter wavelengths.
Okay.
But for longer wavelengths, yes, you can do that.
Okay.
Any other questions about conversions or filters here? So again, my advice is for most of you, either choose the 590 or 550 nanometer as your first filter, or choose full spectrum and then plan on putting filters over or behind your lens to get
Jim?
the actual wavelength you want.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, who's talking?
This is Mary Trujillo.
Oh, Mary, hi, welcome. I didn't know you had checked in.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I've been listening. These magnetic clip-in filters that Kalari have, the
Mhm.
one disadvantage that I see is that it actually goes over the sensor of the camera and not on the back of the lens. So you have to open that up and expose your sensor to dust every time if you're going to change filters.
Yeah,
And-
that is true.
Yeah, I mean, and unfortunately, mirrorless cameras are dust magnets.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe that's not a problem, but that is one consideration, I think. It'd be nice if it was on the back of the lens, but I think it's really over the sensor.
Yeah, I know, you're right about that. That is the case. It
It
drops into
goes-
the lens mount.
It goes into the adapter. There's a slide
Mhm.
that opens and drops in, but
Yeah,
I
and but it,
haven't-
but you
yeah.
do insert it into the camera, not attach it to the
if you
lens.
change lenses,
Yeah,
you're doing a much bigger opening than if you're sliding in one of those Kalari filters.
No, it's not an adapter. It's actually over the sensor.
Well, it's built for the Canon. I'm just talking about the Canon. The adapter for the EOS R to use any of your EF Canon lenses. You wouldn't be able to use it for RF lenses. You can only use it with your EF lenses. That adapter, they have 3 different adapters for the Canon mirrorless cameras to use your EF lenses.
Mhm.
And that's a small, I can bring it next time and show you. The
Yeah.
adapter has on this one that allows you to put different filters in. There's a slot in the middle of that adapter and the slot goes
okay.
into the adapter.
Okay,
Not in the, you're not opening your camera up and putting that into it goes into that adapter model.
I think for Nikon and Sony mounts,
You don't
however,
have that
it's
option.
different. You actually drop the filter into the mount of the camera itself,
Oh, I see.
not into an adapter.
Yeah, the Canon
I
has a
Yeah,
slot.
the
that you-
adapter option sounds better to me, but I don't think they have that for the Z mount that I've seen.
Right.
And at that focal length, dust really shouldn't matter too much. Gonna be nothing but a blur passing through, the light coming through. The filter, if it had a little bit of dust on it at that point.
Oh, yeah, well, no, she's talking about dust on the sensor, not the
Okay.
Yeah,
filter.
no. Yeah, if I have to change, also with these mirrorless cameras, when you turn it off, the sensor is closed.
With some models. No, Nikon just introduced that on the Z8.
Oh, I
but
see.
Earlier models
You guys
don't
are
have
buying the
that,
wrong
the
camera.
sensor, yeah. Yeah, my brand new camera is a Z8, and I love it. But it has a little door that slides
Yeah.
over the sensor to protect it when you turn the camera off.
Yeah.
No brainer there.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, they've always done that.
anywho, let's move on now. We got about
That's a
another
good
half
point.
hour, less than half an hour now.
Good check.
So are there other questions about conversions and filters before we move on? Hearing none, let's go ahead. So the point I will make on this slide is even a very old digital SLR or mirrorless camera will probably work just fine if you convert it to an infrared camera. My first camera was a Nikon D200, which as of now is about 18 years old. It's very, very obsolete. And yet it worked just fine for me for a bunch of years as an infrared camera. Those 2 images that I mentioned earlier that won prizes, those were both made with that D200. So I can certainly recommend it. The newer cameras are, of course, better than old cameras in some ways, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try an old camera. I see online a lot of people that are using Nikon D90s, for example, which again are very old. They're slightly newer than my 200, or sorry, not D90s. Well, D90s are used, but D300s, which are a little bit newer than a D200, but still quite old by current standards. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also buy cameras that are already converted. They're probably going to be more expensive than getting your own old camera converted, but that's an option if you don't have one handy that you can get converted. And as I said, you can get a point and shoot camera converted, but make sure that model of camera with the lens it has is known to work for infrared before you do it, if you happen to have an old point and shoot laying around that you want to try. It's still better to use a DSLR or a mirrorless camera because they have larger sensors. They're just better sensors overall. But nothing wrong with using a point and shoot if that's your best option. So let's move on. Any questions at this point? We've already had a lot of discussion about cameras and filters. If not, we'll move on yet again and talk about lenses. Now, the basic point here is that lenses are a little bit tricky. Not all of them work well for infrared. And the reason for that is that when manufacturers design lenses, they design them for visible light, and they don't design them or test them necessarily for their performance in infrared wavelengths. There are two real issues. I got them broken down into three, but they're really kind of two issues here. There are two issues that you will see with some lenses when you're trying to shoot them with infrared with them. One is focus. Some lenses just don't focus well at infrared, and all lenses focus a little bit differently than they do with visible light. And that's because the refraction index of glass is actually a function of the wavelength of the light that's passing through it. That's why you get chromatic aberration, for example, in lenses, where you'll see little color fringes around the edges of objects near the edge of your frame in your image. That's because the refraction index of ordinary glass varies a little bit depending on wavelength. So if the camera is in focus for red wavelengths, it may be a little bit out of focus for blue wavelengths, and then you'll see a little fuzzy blue halo around your objects potentially. Now, most lenses are corrected for that pretty well these days in their design because they have special types of glass that can compensate for that. But again, those are only designed for visible light. But it's also true that at infrared wavelengths, the focus distance of a lens will be slightly different from what it is in visible light. And so that can cause issues with some lenses. All things being equal, it's better to stop down a little bit rather than shoot your lens wide open, so that you can compensate for that effect. You can increase the depth of field and bring everything back into focus. And normally that's not much of an issue, at least for the shooting that I do, but it's something you might want to bear in mind. The other point, though, is that there's so much good sharpening software out there these days that you can get away with a lot that you couldn't have 5 years ago. And that's true with infrared light too. I mean, I have some lenses that are not tack sharp in infrared, and I shoot them anyway because I can fix that in post-processing now. Okay, so that's one issue, focus. The other issue is the hotspot, and anybody who's shot infrared has probably seen hotspots in their images. And that's also probably the result primarily of the fact that they just don't design lenses to accommodate infrared light. And so you get reflections. You know, the interior of the lens barrel is black. It's designed to absorb light, so you don't get reflections bouncing around inside the lens. But again, they only make sure it's black for visible light, not necessarily infrared light. So you could get reflections bouncing around inside your lens in infrared. You can get, according to Colari-Vision, you can get reflections off your sensor that bounce back into the lens and cause problems too. They actually sell a high-end filter that, you know, it's an extra charge when they convert a camera that's supposed to minimize that.
It's called an anti-smudge filter.
Is that what they call it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Anyhow, so there are a number of reasons why those hot spots happen. Some lenses are very prone to them. Some lenses don't really exhibit them at all. And there are some that are in between. And then there are color issues. You can get a color hotspot or a color aberration in the center of your image that's really probably just caused by a hot spot that only happens at certain wavelengths rather than the full spectrum. But in any case, I've seen that with one or two of my lenses as well sometimes, where you'll get color variation between the center and the edges of your frame, which is really another type of hot spot, I think. So there are websites out there, including those by some of the companies that do infrared conversions, that try and list lenses that do and don't work for infrared. And when I've tried to look up my own lenses on those websites, I find those websites are wrong sometimes because I have lenses that they claim will work for infrared that actually have problems. And so take that with a grain of salt. Your mileage will vary. And the only foolproof way to figure out whether a given lens is going to work with your infrared camera and your sensor under the conditions you shoot is to give it a try. If you have one that's proven not to work very well at all, it probably won't work under any circumstances. And I have one lens like that. But there's no substitute for just trying it out. So here's a list of lenses I've tried. These are all Nikon F-mount lenses. I own a Z-mount camera now, but I don't own any Z-mount lenses. I use an adapter for all my F-mount lenses, and it works really well. And I won't go over this list in detail because not all of you even use Nikon cameras or Nikon mounts. But one I'll point out, a couple I'll point out in particular, this Nikon 17 to 35 is listed on one of those websites as one that works well for infrared. Mine actually gives me problems sometimes. It has a hotspot in it, but not all the time. And I don't even know exactly why that's the case. I don't know what that depends on. I think it has to do with the wavelength of the filter that you're using. It happens to do with the type of, it has to do with the type of scene or lighting conditions that you're shooting in. Hotspots are usually works if there's a strong light source in your frame or not far outside your frame. But it's all sort of voodoo too sometimes. So anyhow, as I say, your mileage will vary, but if you buy a new lens to try for infrared, make sure it's returnable. Okay, a number of tips for lenses and how to use lenses and stuff. As I suggested a minute ago, use a smaller aperture, stop it down a bit to minimize the focus issues. But if you're getting a hot spot, you'll usually sharpen that hot spot if you stop down. So it'll be more pronounced and harder to get rid of in post-processing potentially. So that's the trade-off there. Mirrorless and compact cameras probably have some advantages over DSLRs because they do all their focusing and metering with the actual sensor you're going to use to capture the image. I don't have any experience with that because I don't have a mirrorless camera converted for infrared, but I suspect that's probably the case. Focusing in live view mode on a DSLR probably is advantageous because you're now using the image sensor as your focus sensor as well. I've tried that a little bit, and I can't say I've absolutely convinced myself that it's true. But with the lenses I use, I typically don't have a lot of focus issues anyway, so it's not a big deal for me. More tips. I usually just use autofocus when I'm shooting infrared with my DSLRs. And with the right lens plus a good AI-based sharpening tool in post-processing, you can get truly excellent focus, razor sharp focus with the lenses I use for infrared, and I imagine you'll have similar experience. The Topaz tools in particular, the current Topaz tool is Photo AI, and it includes noise reduction and sharpening and upsizing in a single package, and it has some other special features. It'll recover detail in faces, for example. And it's amazingly powerful. It consumes a lot of processing power on your computer, but it can do amazing work with images that are a little fuzzy in their detail before you run it through that software. So that's one I can recommend without much reservation. Hot spots, as I said, are often more visible when a bright light source is inside or just outside your frame. If you're just getting started with IR, try the lenses you already have before you decide to purchase a new one. And if you're buying a lens specifically because you want to use it for infrared, make sure it's returnable and test it out as soon as you get it, so you can return it if it's not working well with your camera and your filter. Questions about lenses? Okay.
Jim,
Yes, sir.
Some of the companies, I know that Light Pixel opposite, I think Colari does too, will calibrate the lens for IR.
Yeah.
How effective that is.
I don't either. first couple of times, I guess just the first time I converted a camera, I actually sent a lens in with it.
Yeah.
And they did adjust the focus in the camera at infrared wavelengths to work well with that lens. I don't think I did it with the second camera I converted, and I know I didn't do it with the third camera I converted. And I've never had any issues with focusing on those cameras. So I don't know how advisable that is. If you don't send a lens in with the camera, then they will use a lens in the shop.
Right.
That's kind of one of the common lenses that a lot of people use and calibrate the focus with that lens. And I don't know if it really makes any difference if you send your own lens rather than let them use theirs.
Yeah, I just sent mine in. I sent the whole camera and lens that I had with it and said, it's calibrated.
Yeah.
So we'll find out when I go to process them.
I guess so. The other thing is,
Who did you use?
I use Light Pixel.
the other thing is, a lot of camera models nowadays have individual focus calibration built in for each lens you have. And so that, I think, to some degree might eliminate the need for sending the lens to the shop when you have a camera converted too. Again, I haven't tried it specifically for infrared, so I don't know, what problem it solves or anything, but that's a possibility if you run into focus problems. Let's move on here. Talk a little bit about capturing infrared images, and I'm not going into a lot of detail here. This is just kind of an overview because this is going to be the meat of our next session in 2 or 3 weeks. And post-processing likewise, I'm not going to go into much depth. But metering, exposure metering, the camera sensitivity, in my experience, at infrared wavelengths is similar to what it is in visible light wavelengths. So you can still use the same meter, but it may not give you exactly the same results. And that's why it's absolutely essential to check your histogram. You remember I always tell people this in the first Star Wars movie after Obi-Wan Kenobi died, his ghost kept popping up every now and then, and they would whisper in Luke's ears, "Use the Force, Luke, use the Force." Well, when I die, I'm going to pop up in people's ears and say, "Use the histogram."
So we'll know who it was.
That's right. You'll know
If we're around still.
if you don't recognize my
It
voice.
should
Yeah.
be taught. It really should be taught.
It should be.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Needs
And
to be-
the funny thing is, I have known some very good, highly respected photographers who insist they never look at histograms.
Hmm.
And I don't try and argue with them, but
I sure would.
it's sort of like driving a car and throwing your steering wheel away and saying, "I don't need that." It's really pretty essential.
You
It's
can't
one of
judge
the,
by the brightness of your.
no, you can't. And the histogram is one of the biggest advantages of digital cameras over film cameras. You can evaluate your exposure right after you make it and decide if it's right or not and retake it if it's not. You can't do that with film. And so, yeah, anyhow, use your histogram. If you don't know how to display the histogram on your camera, that's your homework assignment actually, is figure out how to display that histogram before our next session. Okay, for outdoor photos, you can make good outdoor images just about any time of day. You don't have to worry about the golden hour. Indoor photos in general, ambient room light can work pretty well, and window light also works well. I've already shown you an example or two of that. Artificial light sources, tungsten, fluorescent, LED, etc., flash. I've used them all, and they all work with infrared. I haven't tried to get too religiously technical about exactly how they work or how you might adjust things when you're shooting infrared with those light sources. And the reason for that is I've never had to. I've just always gotten results I could work with, so I didn't worry about it. Conditions under which you can shoot: clear blue skies, they work well. Blue skies, one characteristic of infrared images, and this is especially true for old black and white infrared films, is the skies would get very dark because the light they pass is at the blue end of the spectrum, all the way at the far end of the spectrum from infrared light. So they get very dark, and you can easily simulate that when in post-processing in infrared, digital infrared as well. Partly cloudy, you can get very dramatic and moody images that way. Overcast can work well. After sunset, even light of twilight can yield some very interesting colors. I showed an example of that earlier. Studio portraits, window light or studio lights, I've gotten good results with all of them. And here are a few examples. This is a clear blue sky shot with my original, my D200. And you can see how black the sky is there. And that I did that in post-processing, but it's an expected look for black and white infrared images. Here's a partly cloudy infrared image. This is a panorama actually of a thunderstorm near Escalante, Utah. And again, a dark sky, but again, I made sure that sky got dark in post-processing, but you have control over that. Another partly cloudy image, an abandoned house in the town of Ludlow, California, which is a defunct Route 66 stopover. Just south of Interstate 15, or Interstate 40 rather. You've seen this one before. This is the image that took that prize. Partly cloudy. Here's an overcast image. This is a ponderosa on top of a big hunk of lava near Sunset Crater. Sort of a bonsai ponderosa growing under very harsh conditions. And actually, if I were gonna, this is an old image. I probably made this eight years or so ago. I would probably crop out a bit of that sky now if I were gonna redo this image. But you can see what infrared light does for it and how much that foliage glows in infrared. Here's an overcast sky image of a place you probably recognize. This is the Slick Rock at Red Rock Crossing. And again, look at how that foliage glows.
Looks like snow.
It does. And yeah, there are lots of infrared landscape images that people mistake for snowy images, especially in black and white. I've shown this one already, but this is twilight at the south rim, where those colors, when I processed it, those sort of you know, otherworldly colors really came out. Here, and again, you've seen these images before, but with window light and studio light shooting models, you know,
That's really different.
Good.
Soft window light.
good light both ways. That's really more a function of the size of the light source. These were big windows in the stairwell of Jordan High School.
Repeat that with the strobes too.
Yeah, oh yeah, you could easily. That's right. And this was from a relative, the one on the right was from a relatively small light source. So the light is more directional.
Yeah, closer to the light, the softer it gets.
Let's see, what's next? Oh, raw processing of infrared images. First of all, rule number one, always shoot raw, because you're gonna need to post-process infrared images out of your camera, almost without exception, at least in my experience. Now, John, what John just said about the 830 nanometer filter might make a liar out of me, but apart from that, any other filter, you're almost certainly gonna want to do some significant post-processing. So yes, shoot raw. It's by far better than shooting in JPEG. Unprocessed image is usually not very pleasing, and some of them are downright ugly when they first come out of your camera. Depends on the filter and the white balance setting and all of that sort of thing. I don't worry about white balance when I'm shooting because, first of all, the white balance range that my cameras support isn't even wide enough to give you a good looking color image. You know, on the LCD screen of your camera. So I just don't worry about it. I know people who set their cameras to shoot monochrome, to shoot black and white, but they shoot raw files, so the color information is all still there. It just displays the image on your LCD screen in black and white. But that supposedly lets them evaluate the image better than if you're displaying ugly colors on your LCD screen. I don't worry about that sort of thing too much because I've kind of learned what to expect from different scenes when I shoot them in infrared. And I really don't care what the colors look like on the LCD screen.
Yeah, that's why you should neutral or shade.
Yeah, I think I usually set it to either daylight or auto for
Yeah.
white balance. But anyhow, so I've listed a series of raw processing steps here. I don't think I'm even gonna try and go over them because we're running out of time for one thing. But and this is just an example chain of events in the processing of an image. It will vary from one image to the next. The one thing I will say, this custom white balance profile, I'm gonna come back to that when I talk about links. But Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, out of the box, they don't give you a wide enough white balance range to capture the white balance you probably want when you convert your raw files. And so you can load custom profiles for your camera that broaden that range and let you get whatever white balance you want. And I actually have links to a couple articles with instructions for how to do that in the package here.
You can also do a DNG profile of your own camera.
Yeah, that's what the links are for.
Okay.
But yeah, that's and yeah, the cameras are the profiles are specific to your camera model. So if you have two different infrared cameras, you'll have to do two different profiles. But they're worth doing because they give you more flexibility in your raw processing. Other than that, I don't think I'm going to talk about any of these details here because they're all pretty routine. For monochrome images, let's see here. The only thing I'll say about monochrome, and I'll give you examples next time when we talk about processing, but when you convert the image to black and white, you can use the built-in black and white function, black and white layer or black and white image processing in Photoshop to do that. Or you can use specialized tools like Nik Software Silver Effects Pro, which is now actually provided by DxO, not Nik anymore. But and there are other specialized black and white processing tools out there too. They give you different results. This one certainly can give you different results from what the built-in black and white in Photoshop does. So you may be tempted to try both of them and see which one you like better. I do that sometimes. In fact, sometimes I do both and then blend the results of the two to get a final image. But anyhow, you have lots and lots of choices when you're converting to black and white, and I will illustrate those next time. Let's see, anything more I should talk about here? Probably not. I mentioned a little earlier the idea of color toning your black and white images, and I'll give you an example or two of that next time when we walk through the process. Let's see here. For color images, here's an example, and this is only an example. Swapping the red and blue channels, that's something that's pretty important in a lot of cases, and you'll probably want to use that if you do color infrared images. I'll show you how to do that. Actually, does everybody here know how to use actions in Photoshop? Well, I'll give you an illustration of that. Very, very powerful thing. It's amazing how much you can do with actions. And I have actions that swap the red and blue channels and do some of the other things we'll be talking about too. I'll be happy to share those actions with you, and I'll show you how to load them and use them. But anyhow, swapping red and blue channels and lots of other color adjustments too. Some of them are listed here. Are also very useful when you're processing color infrared images. Okay, so links and references and stuff. The first three links on this slide are the three companies that I recommend for conversions, and they also have just a wealth of information on their websites about the nuances of infrared photography, how to do it, what the filters do, and you name it. There's a wealth of information out there from them. There are a few other links in here. I won't describe them in detail, but there are also places you can go to learn more about infrared, how to do infrared photography. The first one on this page is an article that describes how to do the red and blue channel swapping. It's the method I use, and I've automated that method by putting it into an action. And so you won't, it's a good idea for you to understand how this method works, but if you use my action, it happens instantaneously once you turn on that action. So you won't have to mess with it every time. The next two links here, second and third links on the slide, these talk about how to make that custom DNG profile that Sherry mentioned, and where to install it in your Photoshop installation so that it will actually work. I actually recommend that you look up one or both of those and go ahead and implement that, follow the directions they give you and implement that on your computer so that you're prepared to do it after our next session. If you have any questions, the other thing too, raw converters other than Photoshop actually sometimes give you a wider range of white balance settings than Camera Raw or Lightroom do. So you may not need this custom profile or anything similar when you're using those other raw converters. More and more these days, I'm using the DxO PhotoLab raw converter for my work. And I usually don't have to, I can usually get a white balance I want without doing any special steps like this in that converter. It has some other advantages too. It has built-in noise reduction, which is really good. It sort of has a built-in poor man's HDR function too. I can maybe demonstrate that next time when we talk about post-processing. But it's pretty handy to have that. Let's see, if you Google infrared photography, you'll find a zillion sites that talk about it. You can search for infrared photo or infrared photograph on Facebook and Instagram and see zillions of examples. There are lots of infrared photographers out there who are posting images, and some of them are amazingly good photographers. So I certainly can encourage you to look at some of that. What else here? We used to have an infrared special interest group and forum in the Camera Club, but they've now dropped those from the website. So we don't have that anymore. I'm suggesting a meetup group or something instead. I'd like to, as I've said earlier, I'd like to get a community of infrared photographers established locally and in the club, so that we can share images and go do photo shoots and tips, or share tips and tricks and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So
Yes, please.
yeah.
That'll be similar to our spontaneous trips that we're trying to get going to.
I agree. That's a good thing. But it's nice to have a community of people who share the interest. Yeah. And so I'm hoping.
But that's one way to get more people in.
Yeah. All true. I have links to my own website and social media pages here, and I will share a copy of these slides with everybody here. I wanted to wait till after the presentation in case anybody found mistakes or made a liar out of me and I had to update the slides. But I'll send these to everybody who's on the list here. So I think that's it. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Your homework assignment is make sure you know how to display your histogram. If not, I'm going to come up and whisper in your ear and obnoxiously.
And you're not dead yet.
Yes,
No.
that's right. And adios. Thank you for participating in this. It's been quite enjoyable for me, and I hope it hasn't been
Thank you,
boring for you.